The poem God's Grandeur by Gerard Manley Hopkins is such a lovely sonnet. It's a beautiful hymn of praise to God, and we can really appreciate if we look at the content, but we'll understand it better if we also look at how it's created, the form of the poem. And to get at that, I'm going to just take you through the rhythm of it, the kind of sonnet it is, and I think then you'll be prepared to really get a sense of what Hopkins is trying to do here. Now, the first thing we can have a look at is the rhyme scheme. And as you go through it, a lot of sounds are repeated. So as you can see, God here rhymes with rod, right? And then foil and oil rhyme with each other. And this gets repeated quite a bit. So we have trod here again, rod and trod, and then toil, soil, shod, and then we start to get some different rhymes towards the end. So we have spent, things, went, springs, and a little bit further down here yet, we have bent and we have wings. Now, this particular rhyme scheme, ABBA, ABBA, and then CD, 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 this is what we call a Petrarchan sonnet. So, not a Shakespearean sonnet, but a Petrarchan sonnet. There we go. And the one interesting thing about a Petrarchan sonnet, well, actually, there are lots of interesting things, but one thing to notice here is just how often these different sounds are repeated in the poem. And that ties in quite well with what Hopkins is doing here. If you look at his line where he says, generations have trod, have trod, have trod, you really get the sense of weariness, of repetition. So the rhyme scheme certainly helps with that. The other thing we can say about each line is that in typical sonnet form, we have 10 syllables. So 10 syllables. And we'll talk about the rhythm in a little bit here. And most of the time that works out perfectly, except in line 3, where Hopkins fudges it a little bit. So you have to say gathers like one syllable and tua like one syllable as well. And then it's 10 lines. But that's the only place in the poem where it's just a little bit awkward. Petrarchan sonnets also are organized a little bit differently than Shakespearean sonnets. In Shakespearean sonnets, you often have a quatrain, right? So 4 lines that kind of function together. And you see that here somewhat too, right? With ABBA here, ABBA. But the bigger division in a Petrarchan sonnet is between the opening 8 lines, which we call the octave, and then the final 6 lines, all right, so 6 more lines at the end, which are called the sestet. And very often in these types of poems, there is some kind of poetic turn here, or some kind of change in focus once you get to the sestet. That is true in this poem as well. We have, and for all this, right? We summarize what came before, we draw it to a conclusion, and the rhyme scheme helps with this as well. And by the way, not every Petrarchan sonnet has exactly the same rhyme scheme. Sometimes you have slight differences in the sestet. We talked a little bit about repetition just now, and Hopkins actually talks sometimes about the importance of parallelism. We actually have an entire course on Hebrew parallelism, and one of the things that you learn there is that if you look at Bible verses, poetic Bible verses, they often repeat ideas. So if you look at Psalm 51 verse 2, for instance, it says, wash away all my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin. You can see there that wash and cleanse are parallel, and so are iniquity and sin. And what you have here really in this type of Hebrew parallelism is that you have concept A, right, whether it's washing or iniquity, which is mirrored by concept B, cleansing or sin. And Hopkins pointed this out as well, and he said, this is actually a feature of poetry in general, that poetry is all about repetition and parallelism. You see it in different ways. So for instance, if you have a simile, right, then what you say, and usually a simile starts with as or like, this is like that. You say A is like B. So in a simile, we have that sense of parallelism. We compare two different things. The same thing applies for a metaphor, and a metaphor is even more direct. For instance, we might say the warrior is a lion on the battlefield, right? We simply say A equals B, but the same structure is there. And this happens with so much poetry that it's really a deepening. We reflect on reality, we meditate on it, and we deepen our experience of it. You see that in this poem as well, of course, as he goes through it and he thinks about nature and he deepens his own understanding. But there's more to it. If you look towards the end of this poem, he talks about the dearest freshness deep down things. And that's a nice theme for thinking about how nature is understood by Hopkins. He uses a special word for how we should think about nature. And that particular word is inscape. So, inscape. And what he meant by inscape is that God's creation has a kind of deeper reality, a deeper sense of life and purpose. There's a unique design in everything. So, if you're looking at a tree or a flower, it's created by God and it has its own special design. It also has a kind of energy, and that energy wants to be expressed externally. So in our poem, it talks about God's grandeur, in a sense, flaming out, right? Oozing out. It's as if this inner identity, this inscape, wants to come out and be expressed externally. There's a hidden depth and a hidden meaning to reality. And that's that dearest freshness deep down things. So it's important to recognize that, because then we understand that Hopkins is not just describing beautiful things or the majesty of God, but he's describing a certain perspective on what reality is and how we appreciate it. Poetry is the perfect way to appreciate that, because poetry, as we've said, is about deepening, right? Parallelism, seeing the connections between things. And that's what he's doing in this poem as well. All right, then. So at this point, we have a pretty good sense of how the poem is constructed, but we can zoom in a little bit more yet and talk about the rhythm. And when we read sonnets, as we've seen before with sonnets by Donne and so on, we see that a lot of them have a kind of iambic rhythm. So if we think of an iambic rhythm, right? An iamb is one unstressed syllable followed by a stressed syllable. And if we do this repeatedly, we get this pa-pum, pa-pum, pa-pum pattern. Now, Hopkins suggested that in poetry, what we often like is surprises. We like to move away from expectations. And he liked to use the word counterpoint to describe this. So counterpoint, which is actually a term from music. If you have two melodies kind of working together, that's what we call counterpoint. In poetry, what this looks like is, let's say every so often you reverse the regular rhythm. So you start with a stress and then an unstressed syllable. These two things work as counterpoint. But of course, you can only recognize this if you have one main rhythm and then the other one plays off against it, right? Now, if you look at this poem, you might have noticed something funny or something interesting, and that's the fact that many of the words have a little accent above them. This is what Hopkins himself put in the poem. He wanted us to stress certain syllables, and he was very insistent about it. You might say he stressed the importance of this himself. Why did he do that? Well, I think a big part of it is that just as inscape makes us recognize the unique identity of objects and things and parts of nature, these stresses are also about kind of stressing the importance of the word, slowing down, finding the depth in the word. And really, that's what these stresses tend to do. And what Hopkins does a lot in the poem is he doesn't give us a nice iambic rhythm. Often he puts two or three stresses next to each other to force us to slow down. There's this kind of jagged rhythm to the poem. You cannot fall asleep here. You really have to pay attention. And it's as if he's saying, listen up now, this is important. So let's have a look at this and see how he works with these stresses. If you examine the first line, right, it starts iambic. So we have the world. You can probably hear that. The world is stressed, is charged, right? And then he tells us, okay, here I want you to stress it in a certain way. So he says, with, that's stressed, the grandeur of God. Now, the last one is stressed normally again. We have the iambic rhythm. So if you look at this closely, what you can see is that we have two regular iambs here. It's going to get a little bit messy. And we have one regular iamb at the end. And in between, we have two trochees, right? So if you remember from John Donne, we have trochees, and these are where we have a stress followed by an unstressed syllable. This is a great example of counterpoint for Hopkins. But I think most of us would actually not use this kind of scansion when we go through the line. Most of us would say it slightly differently. We would say, the world is charged, and then after that we would depart from Hopkins. We would say, with the grandeur of God, right? With the grandeur of God. And if you have this rhythm where you have two unstressed syllables followed by a stressed syllable, and then the same thing again, each of these is called an anapest. So an anapest is different from a trochee and different from an iamb. It's pa-pa-pum. And I would say that's actually more natural. The world is charged with the grandeur of God. Hopefully you agree with me that that sounds more natural. Most scholars point this out as well. But Hopkins is insistent here. He wants it slightly differently. The world is charged with the grandeur of God. Changes the meaning slightly, doesn't it? Right? Really emphasizes this word with. So you can probably agree or disagree with Hopkins on this particular point, but as you go through it, there are definitely areas where you will agree that you have multiple stresses in a row. So in the second line, for instance, we have like shining from shook foil, right? Two stresses in a row. It's very hard to read that in an iambic way. And then we go on, it gathers to a greatness like the ooze of oil crushed. So stress on this word here and then a period right at the beginning of the line. That upsets your expectations. It really puts the emphasis on crushed. If we go to the next line, we have this unusual kind of stress. Generations have trod, right? There's a kind of weariness, I think, to stressing the word in just that particular way. There's a tiredness in it. And then if we go to the next line, here Hopkins really pulls out all the stops. So he says, and all is seared with trade, bleared, smeared with toil. Do you hear all those stresses in a row? That's unusual, isn't it? And it, again, has this effect of just really emphasizing how bad it is. Maybe one more example here in the eighth line. The soil is bare now, nor can foot feel being shod. So there too we have these stresses that slow down the line, make us think about what is being said, and are really insistent in terms of the tone. One final interesting point here as we wrap up. Over time, Hopkins would develop his own rhythm. And we call this kind of rhythm sprung rhythm. Okay, so I got to find a spot here with some room. Here we go. Sprung rhythm. And the way in which sprung rhythm works is that, and this is very rough because people have written entire books about this, but the way in which sprung rhythm works is that you have a set number of stresses per line. So let's say you pick a line and you say, I'm going to have 5 stresses in this line, right? Then where you put the stresses is not all that important. And in fact, you can have as many unstressed syllables as you want. It's just the fact that you need to have 5 stressed syllables. For Hopkins, that was actually a more natural kind of rhythm, right? And over time, he really developed this in his own particular way. And often people disagree a lot about where the stresses actually go in the line. But in this poem, God's Grandeur, he's not quite there yet. We see hints of sprung rhythm with all of these repeated stresses. But for the most part, he's giving us what he called counterpoint. So a regular rhythm, which is mostly iambic, and then some surprises along the way where he changes the emphasis. Okay, so at this point, hopefully, you have a good sense of how Hopkins composed this poem, and this puts us in a place where we can now start talking about the actual content.